Anne leaves wife who adopts old lady from nursing home until she gets a letter when lady dies. Anne Fisher lost her mother when she was 52. Anne and her mother Fiona had been very close, and her loss left her devastated. But nothing filled the vacuum Fiona left in her life. A week after Fiona's passing, the retirement home in which she'd lived called Anne and asked her to pick up her mother's personal effects. What no one expected, even Anne, was that she wouldn't be coming home alone. When Anne walked into the retirement home, memories of her mother flooded back and she had to stifle a sob. She headed for the reception desk and asked about her mother's belongings. "Mrs. Fisher," the receptionist said sympathetically, "if you like, we can load the boxes with your mother's clothing and effects into your car." The receptionist was interrupted by a cry. "Annie? Annie Carson? Is that you?" Anne turned and saw a frail-looking elderly woman standing before her. "Mrs. Grove? It's been over 30 years," she gasped. Mrs. Gove limped over and placed her arms around Anne. "Oh, Anne, seeing you is almost like being with my Simon again," she whispered. Anne hugged Mrs. Gove and tears flooded her eyes. Simon. How long had it been since she'd last thought about Simon? Years, probably since Mandy was born, and she'd finally made peace with her past. But once when she'd been the happy, lively Annie Carson, she'd been in love, madly, completely in love with Simon Gove. They'd met in college at a campus bar. Anne had been sitting with her roommate when she'd suddenly been doused in ice-cold water. She jumped to her feet with an angry cry, only to find herself face to face with the most beautiful boy she'd ever seen. Anne had opened her mouth to remonstrate, but the boy dropped to his knees in front of her. "You're so beautiful," he said. "And this was the only way I could think of to get your attention, to get you to notice I'm alive. Please forgive me and say you'll marry me?" Anne burst out laughing, and May, her roommate, exclaimed, "Annie, this guy deserves an A+ for effort. Marry him already!" It had been a wonderful night. Anne and Simon had been inseparable from that night on, and when he proposed for real 2 years later, she accepted. He took her home to meet his parents, and they were very welcoming. "You're the first girl Simon has ever brought home," Mrs. Gove had exclaimed, "and you're the prettiest thing I've ever seen." He was right about that. By the end of the visit, Mrs. Gove and Anne had been best friends, and when Simon met Anne's mother, Mrs. Carson had been delighted with her daughter's fiancé. Anne had believed that she was living a fairy tale, that everything was perfect. She was 23, she was about to become a teacher and marry the man of her dreams. Then 2 days before the wedding, Anne and her mother went to pick up the dress, and when they got home, they found Simon's father sitting on their doorstep, his head between his hands. "Mr. Gove," Anne cried, "what are you doing here so early?" Mr. Gove dropped his hands and struggled to his feet, and when she saw his ravaged face, Anne knew something terrible was about to happen. "It's our Simon," he whispered. "There was a car accident last night, and he and his friend David, they—" A horrible sound, half scream, half sob, choked Mr. Gove. Anne ran into the house up the stairs and locked herself in the room. She lay on her bed and let her fear wash over her. "He's a liar. My Simon is all right. He's all right." A little later, she heard someone knocking on the door. "Annie," she heard Mrs. Gove's voice say, "please let me in." She couldn't say no to her, not when the pain she heard echoed her own so exactly. The two women held each other and wept until there were no tears left. "Simon will always live on in our hearts," Mrs. Gove had said to Anne after the funeral. "You're very young, Anne," she said. "One of these days you will wake up and you will discover it's a beautiful day despite the pain. You may meet a young man and you will discover that you can love someone else, and that's okay. It doesn't mean that you love Simon any less. It just means that you are human and that you are healing." Anne listened with tears running down her cheeks, shaking her head in denial. "No," she cried. "Yes," Mrs. Gove said gently, "because that is what Simon would have wanted. He would have done anything for you. So do this for him. Be happy." Now, nearly 30 years later, Anne was standing with Mrs. Gove. "Why are you here?" Anne asked. "I'm afraid Alfred passed away 6 months ago," she explained. "He had Alzheimer's, and so I sold the house and we moved here. We were in the married couple's wing. They've just moved me here." Mrs. Gove gave Anne another hug. "Do you have a family?" Anne nodded. "Yes, I do," she confirmed. "My daughter's grown up. She's left the house. My husband, well, he spends a lot of time working. He golfs on the weekends," Mrs. Gove said softly. "I guess being a woman means being alone, mostly." Anne looked at Mrs. Gove and an idea blossomed. Maybe not. When Anne arrived home that afternoon, she was not alone. "Hey, honey," she called her husband. "Jack?" Her husband came out smiling. "Who's that?" he asked, looking at Mrs. Gove, who was standing in the lounge with her suitcase beside her. "Jack," Anne said, "this is Mrs. Gove, a very dear, very old friend. She's moving in with us." "What? What are you talking about?" Well, Anne said, you always said my mother was welcome to live with us. But she didn't, Jack protested. Because she… Anne stopped and searched for words that wouldn't hurt. Because she didn't like me, Jack cried. You think I don't know that? Why do you think I suggested she move in? I knew she never would. Anne stared at Jack. It was a scheme to make yourself look good? She asked. You didn't mean it? Well, that's too bad because Mrs. Gove is moving into the suite I fixed for my mother. That woman moves in and I move out, Jack shouted. Go ahead. I honestly don't think it will have an impact on my life if you leave. Besides, you forget this is my house. I bought this house before I met you. I don't need you, Jack. Not since you stopped loving me. That night, Jack slept on the couch and Mrs. Gove slept in the guest suite. In the morning, he packed his bags and left the house. Anne called her daughter Mandy on Skype and explained everything. Mom, I'm not surprised you kicked Dad out, but I am surprised you took in some random old woman. Mandy, Mrs. Gove is not some random old woman, Anne cried. She's the mother of the love of my life, the boy I was going to marry when I was 23. She's so alone, and I love her. I miss Gran so much, and I think Mrs. Gove and I will be good for each other. I want you to meet her, okay? I think you will love her. You were going to marry someone else? Asked Mandy. Tell me about him. So Anne did, and it felt good to talk about Simon, those wonderful dizzy years when she was Annie and had believed that dreams could come true and that love was forever. When Mandy came to visit for Thanksgiving, she fell in love with Mrs. Gove, and the two giggled and gossiped like schoolgirls. Anne smiled the whole weekend. She had never felt so good about her life, so relaxed. Then the phone rang, and it was Jack. He asked to speak to Mandy, and Anne could hear him whine. Did you know your mother left me for an old woman? Mandy answered coldly. You were the one who left, Dad. In fact, you left Mom years ago when you stopped paying attention to her being there for her. I've met Mrs. Gove and she's a lovely, gentle lady. I'm glad she's here with Mom. Anne was delighted to have Mrs. Gove with her. The two women spent 2 wonderful years together until Mrs. Gove's already fragile health deteriorated. Towards the end, she was hospitalized, but Anne was there, holding her hand during her last moments, and saw her friend smile and whisper her son's name before her eyes closed for the last time. Mrs. Gove was laid to rest beside her husband and her beloved son. After the funeral, Anne was stunned when Mrs. Gove's lawyer contacted her and asked her to come into his office. He explained that Mrs. Gove had left Anne her entire estate, which amounted to over $1.7 million. He read from the will, Anne Carson Fisher was destined to be my daughter. But fate cheated us. At the end of my life, Anne had been there for me and has become my daughter in truth. Anne was amazed by Mrs. Gove's legacy, but she was even more surprised when her ex-husband called her. Anne, he said in the smartest voice, babe, I was thinking we could get together, start over. Jack, Anne snapped. I'll see you in hell first. Get lost. You are out of my life.